Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for bringing the mic, Jan and Elsa. We appreciate it. I'm so happy to be back at Habitat. Thank you for having me back for 2 weeks. I'm glad. Thank you. I'm glad that we still have a nice group of people together. I have found it quite difficult to be here on Sunday afternoons. Life is just so busy, and I think everybody's finding that, But it's really good to be back. So. To end the year off, we changed the theme from C.S. Lewis to this theme, and this theme could have taken us a whole year actually to cover, because when you ask the question, how has Christianity changed the world? There's quite a famous writer, Harris is his surname. He writes these books. He's, for example, written a book about what would have happened if Hitler won the Second World War. And then he writes a story about a world in which Hitler won the Second World War. Now, if we had to ask ourselves, what would the world have looked like if it weren't for Christianity? What would it have been? And it's a very difficult thing to unravel, right? So if we want to unravel that, it is difficult and it's contentious. There will be people who completely differ from what I'm going to say today. And in the end, in the notes right at the end, I'll give you access to some debates where people debate this. Really intelligent, well-informed people on both sides who have debates about what the impact of Christianity has been on the world. The other thing I want to say before I jump into the detail of my talk is that one could approach this from two directions. The one is to look at the granular detail of what we've achieved as Christians, the good things. There are enough people talking about the bad things we've done. It has become quite fashionable to have things to say about Christianity and Christians, and there is a lot to say about us. We are a collection of sinners who have been saved by grace. And therefore, the fact that we mess up shouldn't happen. It's not good. We're not asking that you condone it, but it's expected. It's par for the course. It's I'm afraid, how God has chosen to impact the world in his wisdom. So we can look at the granular detail. We can ask who started the first SPCA, and we'll find it was a Christian. We can ask who started the first hospitals, and you'll find it was Christians. You can ask who started the first universities, and you'll find it was Christians. But I'm not going to take that direction because we have 2 weeks. And therefore I'm going to use, and you will see quite a bit of him today, this book as the rubric for what I'm going to say today. This book was written by a guy called Tom Holland. If you say this to your children or grandchildren, they'll say, oh yes, the actor. No, not the actor. There's a historian, a British historian called Tom Holland. He's written on the ancient world for his whole career. He's a really, really interesting guy and an interesting writer. And then I think it was about 2019, he came up with this book. Let me just see when it was first published. Now I'm missing the date for some other reason. Oh yes, 2019. So this book was first published in 2019. It's a relatively recent book. And the purpose of this book is, he calls it Dominion, and then he says the making of the Western mind. And the book is only about one thing. It's about how Christianity changed the world. That's what the book is about. And when he wrote this book, he was an atheist leaning towards agnosticism. In other words, somebody who thinks God doesn't exist, but who leaves a bit of space open. And I think if you were to ask Tom today, he would call himself a Christian. The writing of this book drew him to Christ in the end, and drew him back to the church. And I'm sure you'll find many things he says that you won't agree with. But what he does in this book, he delineates the ancient world which he knew well, and then he asks the question, this ancient world that we think we like, but that when we look at it in detail, we will find we don't like as much as we thought we did. How was it changed by the fact that Christianity came? And if we look at the West today, the Western cultures today, and those impacted by the West, like us, because we were a British and a Dutch colony, we were impacted, and many of us have descendants coming from there. Those of us who were impacted by the West, how did Christianity play a role in that? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start us off tonight, or this afternoon, with a bit of an introduction. And then I'm going to take the first 2 points that Tom Holland makes. And I'm just going to put those on the table. And all I'm going to do next week, I'm going to take the other 4 to 5 points that he makes, and I'm going to put them on the table. That's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to take those big themes that he sees as the impact of Christianity on the Western world. And I'm going to lay those out for us with some arguments why that is the case. Now, Christianity was born, as we said in that first series, into the Roman world. We had Caesars who saw themselves as gods. Now, before that, Rome actually had a sort of a democracy, and then they had a benevolent dictator who took over, and then they became complete dictators again. And Christianity gets born into this Roman world. Even Jerusalem is under the control of the Romans at the point when Jesus is born and when he lives his life. And he is, in some senses, killed by the Roman Empire. At this point, the world is ruled in a sense of, now they didn't know of people in Australia and people all the way in Africa, but let's call it the Western world was ruled by the Romans and by the Caesar. People like Nero, Augustus, and then we all know of Brutus, who played a role in Julius Caesar's death. Some very important and very famous people played a role. Now, what was the Roman society like? It was very stratified. It really depended on which class you were born about how your life would have been, because the society was very much based on that class, and that determined what you could and could not do. They were very promiscuous and had complete sexual freedom. And I think relativism, as we see it today, in other words, not knowing when something is true or right or wrong, you can decide for yourself, was really massive in those times already. It's not a new thought. It's not something that's come up recently. It's just re-emerged quite recently. And human life was very unimportant at this point. That's why, if you wanted to make a political point, you would crucify a bunch of people outside of town, close to a road, so that everybody could see them die. Not only that, you would leave them on the crosses so that the birds would start eating in their bodies and that they would rot and stink. That's how much respect there was for human life if you were of the wrong class. Of course, if you're a Roman citizen, as Paul, you know Paul, at some point when he gets in trouble, he says, but I'm a Roman citizen, and they all get the fright of their lives because you can't mess with a Roman citizen. And then he calls upon Caesar and he gets sent to Rome. So he was of the right class, and it was very much a society that was built on that. There were many interesting habits in the society, and I don't have time to unpack all of them, but let me take the idea of abortion and infanticide. If a baby was born in the Roman world, that baby would be placed on the floor in front of the father, and the father would decide to accept or reject that baby after birth. If the father decided to not accept the baby would be placed outside somewhere to die. Mostly, it was the girls. It wasn't only girls, but it was mostly girls. Those babies then, before Christ came, would be picked up often by people who wanted to run prostitution rings, because it was a good way for them to find prostitutes. Okay? So children had very little value in that society, in the true sense. And there was real slavery, much closer to what we know in the modern world slavery than what the Bible speaks of. When the Bible speaks of slavery, it's actually something very different to what we read when we read about modern slavery. But this was much closer to that. Slaves could get free, but often they were bound for the rest of their lives, and they were seen as property. It was pluralist. In other words, what I mean by that is you could believe anything you like as long as you're not exclusive. They had a pantheon, as we said in those first weeks, with all the gods in, and as long as you prayed to all the gods, you were fine. Just don't tell us you have the only God. That was the only thing. That's why in the beginning Christians were called atheists, because they didn't believe in all of these gods. And the accusation was that they were atheists because they wouldn't believe in all of these gods. And into this world, let me stop there, because we can continue for the whole day just about that, but Habitat's built on half an hour, right? So I have to move. Christianity was born as a fringe movement of Judaism. People like Paul and Peter actually died in Rome. They went to Rome, the capital city of this empire, and they died. They were seen as nobodies. They were seen as nuisances, and they were gotten rid of. A person like Nero blamed the Christians when the city burnt down, and there are copious amounts of information about what he did to the Christians to punish them for burning down the city. And there was a lot of persecution and martyrdom. And yet, today, we find many people writing books about the Stoics, about the Greek societies before, and then the Roman societies, trying to tell us that we should build our lives upon this. And Tom Holland fell in love, if you read what he writes about this, he fell in love with the Roman societies as a child. And that's why he started researching this. And he wrote quite a few books about massive events in those ancient societies. But then he comes to a point, and I'm going to read a few quotes today, so apologies for that, but I think it's better to hear these people in their own voices. And then it comes a point where he says the following. This is him speaking. He says, the heroes of the Iliad, favorites of the gods, golden and predatory, had scorned the weak and the downtrodden. So too, for all the honor that Julian paid them, had philosophers. The starving deserved no sympathy. Beggars were best rounded up and deported. Pity risked undermining a wise man's self-control. Only fellow citizens of good character who, through no fault of their own, had fallen on evil days might conceivably merit assistance. This was the world, the Roman world into which Christianity was born. But we also know the end of this story. Because in the end, Jesus, God, Christianity won. Because today, we call our children Peter and Paul and our dogs Nero and Brutus and Caesar. And I'm being a little bit facetious, right? But I think we mustn't for one moment underestimate this sentence here, how unbelievable it would have been for a person in the first century, Christian or not. If we told them that in 2,000 years from now, we would call our children Peter and Paul and our dogs Nero and Caesar, they would have said, there's no way this is going to happen. This little fringe group would never be able to change the world. And we didn't. God did through the work of his church. And if we look at the results of this in a place like Europe, and if you read the history of Europe, if you read I lived in the UK for 2.5 years, and then if you read the history of Britain before Christianity came there, you realize nobody in Europe wanted to go there. It was too dark and damp and unfriendly. It was a horrible place. You sent people there if you didn't like them. Okay. And then Christianity came there and to the rest of Europe, and quite a lot started to change. And if we look at European civilization or European societies today, there is so much to admire. And it has become unfashionable to say that, right? When we look at these things, we should feel ashamed for the colonialism and all of that. And look, as I said right in the beginning, let's not argue about the fact that we have a mixed history. There are many things we should apologize for. But if you've been to one of these cathedrals, if you've seen the Sistine Chapel and you've seen the painting on that roof, you cannot other than be amazed by it. You spoke about awe this morning, Janko. This puts one in awe when you stand there and you see what these people accomplished. These barbarians when it all started. And yet, when we look at Europe today, quite a bit has changed. What we see now, what we see Europe producing and doing and facing now is a lot different to what we have seen. And in the last 50 years, especially after the Second World War, but about 20, 30 years after that, and we can have a very interesting conversation about the philosophical roots of this, a lot has changed in Europe. If you've been there recently, you will see that the architecture now looks postmodern, the new buildings that are being built. Unless you burn the Notre Dame down by accident, then you'll rebuild it because you do realize it's something really special. The art itself looks very different. People will do things to themselves. There is a massive issue with people coming there as refugees and changing the society, and something like Islam growing in places like Europe and in Britain. They are facing so many cultural questions that have become very difficult for them to answer. Not just for them, for all of us. Those of us who have a Western heritage and who are bound to that to some extent, I think we have to ask the question, why are we the way we are? Why do we think the way we do? Which part of it can be affirmed? Which part of it can be redeemed? And which part of it should be rejected? Because we bring things with us which should be rejected just because of our culture. But there is also a lot that we can affirm and redeem. Okay? And I think that question is being asked in Europe much, much, much more directly than it is being asked here. We are still in a relatively safe space in many of these respects because it's not going great in our own country, right? So nobody's fleeing here in great numbers except the poor Zimbabweans with whom it's going a lot worse than with us. But for the rest, we are not finding people fleeing to South Africa in their thousands. We are not seeing the same cultural phenomena that they see in places like Europe. And it has become fashionable to blame faith and religion and to speak poorly of faith and religion. And for the last time tonight, I'm going to say there is a lot to be said. There's a lot we have to own up for. And I've just put a few quotes up here. We don't have to read all of them, but from George Clooney, the actor, to Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists, it's easy to bash faith. Let's just read the last one. We keep on being told that religion, whatever its imperfections, at least installs morality. On every side, there is conclusive evidence that the contrary is the case, and that faith causes people to be more mean, more selfish, and perhaps above all, more stupid. Right? That's Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists. But all over, it's not difficult to find people bashing faith and bashing Christianity. But thankfully, Europe has a very strong intellectual heritage. And this book, I'm going to quote from next. The book is called Straw Dogs, and it's written by a guy called John Gray. Now, he works at the London School of Economics, and he's quite it's not John Gray who wrote the books about Mars and Venus and that one. It's a different John Gray. So I'm using Tom Holland's and John Gray's, but different ones than the ones we are used to. Now, this is one of the most upsetting books you can read, because what he says is that if we are not Christians anymore, and he's not a Christian, he's an atheist. If we are not Christians anymore, we should ask ourselves hard questions about how we run our society, because we are running it on the legacies of Christianity and Christian thought. And then he asks what should happen to a society that has rejected faith and has rejected Christianity, also in places like Europe. And he comes up with very interesting answers. So before I go there, there's one in this previous one where I speak about these differences. So how many people do you think died in the Netherlands last year because of euthanasia? 10,000. They killed 10,000 people last year. And they are busy thinking about laws where a healthy person who wants to die can also be killed. We are still running Lifeline and things like that. In both Canada and in the Netherlands, it has become one of the leading causes of death, euthanasia. Okay? Now, I didn't put anything up here, but you should see the statistics. I can send you articles, very interesting articles, not from Christian publications, from secular publications where they speak about what's happening in some of these countries. Even children now in a place like the Netherlands can be considered for euthanasia. If a child becomes so depressed that they don't want to live anymore, instead of trying to help them, you can now assist them in dying. Okay, that's where European countries have gotten to. And I mean, we can have a long conversation. Maybe one of our habitats, we can talk about moral issues like euthanasia. Now, when you then go to a guy like John Gray, he says the following: the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. If you just let that sentence sink in, we can stop right there. Then you'll understand how you should think if you don't believe in God anymore. Because evolution does not chase truth. It chases only one thing, and that is reproduction, right? To have more offspring. That's what it chases. And therefore, it serves evolutionary success, not truth. To think otherwise is to resurrect the pre-Darwinian error that humans are different from all other animals. John Gray is clearly positioning us as just another animal. Yes, we are bodily. Yes, we share a lot with animals. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But what he's saying is at a completely different level from that. Next quote from him. Today, liberal humanists has the pervasive power that was once possessed by revealed religion. Humanists like to think that they have a rational view of the world, but their core belief in progress is a superstition. Further from the truth than the human animal, about the human animal than any of the world's religions. So what he's saying there is, if we are positive about humanity and the way in which we can live together and make a better future and create progress without God, and which he thinks does not exist, we are more foolish than any religion to his mind. The whole purpose of this book is to say to Western people, if God does not exist, we should think completely differently about the world than we are at the moment. And the main thing we are struggling with, according to John Gray, is that we are still hanging on to some of our pre-Darwinian, before we knew God did not exist. And it's not Darwin. I'm not even going to Darwin today, really. He's using him, right? But our atheistic ideas have now taught us that there is no purpose, there is no progress. We should stop living like there is, because that is a hangover from Christianity. That's basically the point of his book. Okay. Now, hopefully you're quite negative at the moment. Have I succeeded in making you nice and negative? I'm glad. Because this is not the only move that's happening in Europe. One of the most exciting things that is happening there is that there are a whole slew of people who completely disagree with John Gray and who have now started asking questions because of the state of the society. They've started asking questions: what made us different? What made us who we are today? How did we get here? And there are different answers being given. The scientific revolution, there are so many things that people say could be the answers, but there's a massive stream of people who are saying, wait a moment, the main difference between us and the rest of the world is the impact of Christianity. Okay, let me introduce you to 2 or 3 of these people. Just go in the right direction. The woman you see on the screen there is called Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was born in Sudan. She then moved to Egypt for a while. And at the age of 22, she came to the Netherlands, where she was elected to the parliament because she's such an intelligent, well-spoken, opinionated woman. She then became a new atheist. She rejected Islam. She is a massive critic of Islam. If you look up for quotes by her, the majority of quotes are against Islam. Okay, but that's why I'm putting her up here. And quite recently, Ayaan has become a Christian. She and her whole family have been baptized. And what brought her to Christ wasn't an emotional experience. It wasn't a scare. It wasn't the fear of the Muslims. It was her thinking about life, about the inner life, but also the outside life, and what it means, and how we got here, and why it is special. And here are some of her words. Ayaan, so Richard Dawkins then, of course, took her on. We know he's no wilting lily. He loves a good fight, so he took her on. And then Ayaan gave the following response. Ayaan gave a powerful response that Christianity had led to the, inverted commas, her words, flourishing of Western civilization. And then she said, I find that Christianity is actually obsessed with love. That is in the figure of the teaching of Christ. As I see it, and again, I'm a brand new Christian, but what I'm finding out is that this is the opposite of growing up as a Muslim and the message of Islam. The message of Christianity I get is that it's a message of love. It's a message of redemption. And it's a story of renewal and rebirth. So Jesus dying and rising again for me symbolizes that story. In a small way, I felt I died and I was born. That story of redemption and rebirth, I think, makes Christianity actually a very, very powerful story for the human condition and the human existence. And Ayaan makes a very strong case to say that Western civilization, that she knows what it was like in Sudan. She knew, she was a young adult in Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood. She lived in a very secular state, the Netherlands. And after all of this, she has come to the conclusion that they're all missing the mark completely, and that Western societies was built on the Christian ideas. Her husband recently, relatively recently, is a man called Niall Ferguson. Niall is a historian of economics, one of the top thinkers in Europe, a highly respected man, highly respected academic, but also a person who takes part in many public debates and many public conversations about Europe and what it should be. And then he says the following: the first phase was that as a historian, I realized that no society had been successfully organized on the basis of atheism. All attempts to do that have been catastrophic. Okay? He was an atheist and he realized there is no society built on atheism. When he asked himself, how did this society get the way it is? He realized it couldn't have been. It's not. And then he goes on, Christian faith matters hugely. And as a society, we have turned away from it. That explains much more than the rise of social media, the mental health problems that characterize our societies today. We're all sort of running this experiment without God and without religious observance, and it's not going well. But we blame it on the smartphone or on Twitter. I think the real explanation for the mental health epidemic is that we have thrown away those wonderful support mechanisms that evolved over centuries to get us through. And when he says that, he's speaking of faith. So let's go back to Tom Holland then, because I want to make the points that he's going to make. I introduced you to him a little bit earlier. Fascinating guy. You can go and watch some of his videos. It's really interesting to listen to. Probably one of the best debates. There's a man called Grayling is his surname. I've forgotten his name now. a high-end philosopher in Europe. There's a debate between the two of them about the impact of Christianity on the world. It's in one of the links at the end. It's really worth watching. Now, Tom, as I said in that first quote, when he spoke about the world into which Christianity was born, speaks about his own change, and he says the following: the more you live in the minds of the Romans, that's what he did as a historian, and I think even more the Greeks, the more alien they become to seem, the more frightening they come to seem. And what becomes most frightening really is a kind of quality of callousness that I think is terrifying because it's completely taken for granted. There's a kind of innocent quality about it. Nobody really questions it. Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's promoting it. And when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards boasting about how many people he's killed. This is a really terrifying alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it's built on systematic exploitation. In almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And this worried me more and more. This was before he became a Christian. He started realizing, I don't want to live in that world. And this is the world I'm living in, which is different. Why is it different? And then he continues to say the following: assumptions that I have grown up with about how society should be properly organized and the principles that it should uphold were not bred of classical antiquity, still less of human nature, but very distinctively from that civilization's Christian past. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has become hidden from view. It is the incomplete revolutions which are remembered. The fate of those which triumph is to be taken for granted. I hope you get the point that he's making there. The point is that when you change something slightly, you can study it. But when it changes you in the end, when it's so overwhelming, C.S. Lewis at one point says, God is like the sun. You can't look right at him, but without him you can't see anything, right? Because he shines on everything. And the point Holland is making here is to say, because the Christian Revolution was so emphatic in Europe, you can't even see it anymore. It has changed everything so much, and we've gone through so many generations that we can't even think of ourselves as being those Romans any longer. We can't see that that's where we've come from, because we have become Christian in all ways. Now he's going to talk about where this comes from, and then we are well underway, by the way. So let me just see how much time. Yeah, my time is almost up. Okay, so where did this come from? Let's see what Tom Holland says in his own journey. He says the following. Now he's going to talk of the New Testament, and he's going to say this: compacted into this very, very small amount of writing was almost everything that explains the modern world and the way the West has then moved on to shape concepts like international law, concepts of human rights, all these kinds of things. Ultimately, they don't go back to Greek philosophers. They don't go back to Roman imperialism. They go back to Paul, his letters. I think, along with the four Gospels, are the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world. This is a historian who's an unbeliever. And when he looks at the world, he says this about the New Testament that we read. It was revolutionary. It changed the way people thought. It changed the way they behaved. It changed the whole society, according to Tom Holland. And I love what he says here, that it didn't come from, where was it? I think it was in the previous one where he spoke about it not being human nature. It doesn't come from human nature. It's not who we are. If you just leave us to be, that's not the way we end up. And we've seen that all over the world. And then in my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I'm not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian in my way of understanding the world. Okay? And actually, John Gray makes exactly the same point. You'll be surprised to know that one of the people who reviews this book, and he says the following: John Gray from the New Statesman says, a masterpiece of scholarship and storytelling. He sent this to John Gray and he said, will you review this for me? Okay? Because he wanted to hear a pessimist's view on what he was saying about the impact of Christianity. And John Gray 100% agrees with him. So, what are the things specifically of Christianity? What are the thought processes, the paradigms, to use that word, that impacted the world in the way that Tom speaks about? There are two that I'm going to mention today. So, in the area of law and human rights, Christianity changed the way that we think as Western people in two specific ways. Firstly, the idea that we are created in the image of God. Nobody thought that before. Nobody thought that all humans were created in the image of God. It's a uniquely Christian way of thinking about the world. That whether you are highly intelligent or not that intelligent or completely disabled, whether you are physically fine, whether you're old, whether you're young, whether you are born or unborn, you are created in the image of God. And therefore, as a human, you have inherent value and you have inherent right to protection and love. Okay? That was a thought that shook the world. No Roman would have thought like that. And that is shown by Christ dying equally for everybody. He didn't die for the good people. He didn't die for specific groups. He didn't die for those with high status. He died for everybody. The man on the cross next to him could come to faith in that moment. The worst of sinners could come to faith at any point. Christ died for them. But the emperor, the most powerful man, also needed him. Everybody needed him equally. We were all created in the image of God, and Christ died for everyone. This idea radically elevated all people in the sight, and all people needed to be respected and loved and cared for. We couldn't now just care for the elite. We've done it many times since, don't get me wrong. We still do it today. Go to Davidton and come and look at where we live. We're still doing it. But we know we're wrong. And that's the change of Christianity. That we cannot leave the poor to their own devices and not care about them. Okay? And this has created the foundations for modern concepts such as universal human dignity and human rights. There's no way, if you're a Darwinist or if you're an atheist, if you're a materialist, a person who does not believe that we are made in the image of God and that Christ died for everybody, you can leave the second one out and just use the first one. There is no way why all humans should have similar rights. Why? Give me one conceptual reason why all people should have human rights if they are not created in the image of God. That's not how it works in nature. The weak get killed by the strong. The ones who are disabled get eaten first. They get put at the back so they can be eaten first. There is no such thing as equal rights in any other species than in humans. And it's changed the way the world is built, because we have to treat everybody like they have been died for by Christ, and like they have been created in the image of God, because that's what we are taught. And this has created societies that valorize, in other words, make heroes out of people who protect the weak and the marginalized. Mother Teresa, when she died, owned 2 dresses and underwear, and I think 2 pairs of shoes. When she died, that's what she owned. Now, we can have long conversations about her. I'm sure she had many faults like me. But that's what she owned, because she decided to take her whole life and give it to people who were on the street. Why? Because they were created in the image of God, and Christ had died for them, whether they knew it or not. She had to do it because they were worth it. In the Indian caste system, if you are of the wrong caste, you can lie on the street and people can step over you and continue walking. If you're lucky, they're not going to actually step on you because you don't matter. And on the streets, you find people lying, dying. She went there to pick them up. Why? Because she was convinced. If you've ever met a person who was completely a radical, it was her. She was a radicalized Christian. Whatever else you think about Catholicism, we can have other conversations about that. But she was a radicalized Christian. She took these 2 ideas very seriously. And it changed her life and the lives of many other people. And our societies are built on that. Okay? Even the atheists will speak of Mother Teresa with respect because of the way that she has lived. Why? Why would they respect that? It doesn't make sense in the Darwinian understanding of the world. The second one, last one for tonight, and then I've just got a slide to close this with. Pity and compassion. Pre-Christian societies, particularly Romans, viewed pity as a weakness, a defect of the mind. If you feel sorry for others, there must be something wrong with you. That doesn't, Stoics would never think like that. You need to be strong. You need to show it to the world. Christianity's core emphasizes on charity, care for the poor, the sick, and the vulnerable, like orphans and abandoned infants. The command to love your neighbor was normalized through Christianity, and very early in the church, those kids that I spoke about before that were left outside, started picking them up more than the people running prostitution rings, the Christians. One of the ways which Christianity grew in the early Roman world was by picking up these babies and taking them in and helping them grow up in Christ. Okay? Because we've always thought that we should care for the weak. We have always thought as Christians, because that's what Jesus teaches us, to care for those who cannot care for themselves, to care for those who need it the most. Those are the people we love and respect, because that's what Jesus taught us. And that's part of what we see in the West. I don't want to read these first bunch of bullet points. I'm going to just skip them. I've put in too much, so please ignore them. Let's just read the last two bullet points, because the first one is a quote by Ayan and the last one is a quote by Niall. Ayan says, everything we inherited from Christian faith, it's just too casual to cast that aside. When we have done it, I think we have caused ourselves a great deal of damage. And then Niall says, no civilization, no matter how mighty it may appear to itself, is indestructible. And we are seeing, and what these people are arguing for, they are arguing that the West needs to come back to its Christian roots if it wants to survive. And it can be for selfish reasons, that could be very selfish, but the only way it's going to survive if it comes back to the foundation on which it was built. Now, you might not agree with everything they say, but I've given you some links here at the end. This first one is about Tom Holland realizing that he's actually now a Christian. He thought he was still an atheist, and then he realized, oops, I'm still a Christian. I've become a Christian. And he actually has a debate here with A.C. Grayling, which is a very interesting one in this one. There's a very famous essay by one of those old philosophers whose name suddenly slipped my mind, who says, Why I'm Not a Christian. It's a very famous essay that he wrote. And Ayan wrote an essay that says, Why I Am Now a Christian. And she actually references that essay of his to say, I need to explain why I am now a Christian. And she does that in this one. Yeah? And then ARC, the ARC, that's that organization of, let's say, I don't think one should agree with everything they say. Absolutely not. There's nobody you should agree with everything with. But just go and have a look, especially at their YouTube channel, on who they get to speak at their conferences. Because what they're speaking about, fascinating, and they get some of the best intellectuals that you can find to speak at their conferences about the importance of Christianity and Christian thinking and the Christian ideas for a place like Europe. And they have grown massively over the past 7 to 10 years. I think it's worthwhile to go and have a look at them. So next week, we're going to look at the other 4 or 5 of the ideas. The first 2, just to summarize them, law and human rights. In other words, the whole idea that we're made in the image of God and that Jesus died for everyone. And the second one, pity and compassion, that we should care for those who are weak and who are in trouble. Okay, that's 2 of the big impacts of Christianity on the societies that we live in and that we want to live in and continue to live in. Okay, shall we end it there? Okay, thank you everybody. Let me pray and then we can stop there. Jesus, thank you that we can be together and that when you started your movement, when you started your church, when you started changing the world, you did it in your way. Nobody could have predicted what you would have done. Nobody could have seen how it would have grown and what impact it would have had. People thought of you as just a wandering preacher there doing a few things, and it's all going to die out. As I'm thinking now of one of the people of the Sanhedrin who said, if it's not from God, it will peter out. Well, clearly, he knew what he was talking about because it didn't peter out. Thank you that we can live today in that legacy. And I want to just ask, Lord Jesus, that you will help us to think Christianly, that you will help us to live Christianly, that you'll help us stay out of the cultural dichotomies, that we won't be dragged into those as easily as we are, but that we will do the hard work and listen to your Spirit and read your word and talk amongst each other so that we can build up the alternative that is your alternative, because that is what's changed the world. Thank you that we can pray for this week, that you'll help us even in this week to be part of changing the world, that we will be reminded that every person we meet was created in the image of Christ. That even those of us living here in South Africa, where there's so much poverty and so much suffering that our hearts become hard, that you will soften those a little bit again. And you will just remind us that people who are suffering should be cared for. Even if we see them every day and we can't help all of them, help us to not become hard of heart when we see this around us. Don't just change the world, Jesus, change us. I pray this in your wonderful name. Amen.